Welcome to the Awe and Wonder podcast, AAC and AT. I'm Sarah Kinsella.
And I'm Brenda Del Monte.
We are beyond thrilled today to have our special guest, Dr. David Koppenhaver here. We're so excited to be able to talk to him about literacy. You all know this already, but I'm going to say it anyway. Dr. Koppenhaver is the co-author of Comprehensive Literacy for All, the book that we all know and love, and that really has changed our careers. He's co-founder of the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, where you probably get all of your resources. I know we do. And a professor of reading education. And I'm curious because I think you have a change in your career recently, right? Have you maybe retired recently?
Yeah, as of June 30th, I'm retired from Appalachian State. That doesn't mean I'll quit working. It does mean I'll stop teaching classes formally, and you won't find me serving on committees.
Okay, congratulations. But we'll still hear from you, I'm sure. That's good.
You sound like you retired like the rest of the people in the field, which is kind of.
Yeah, kind of, I guess. Yeah, plenty of writing and teaching left to do in the field.
Great.
Good.
Yes. Dave, is there a student that comes to mind that just kind of blew your socks off when it comes to literacy skills? Like maybe someone who made you think, wow, okay, all students really need opportunities for literacy instruction. I'm sure there might have been many.
I'm going to reframe the question because I think it assumes that there was a time that I didn't think that all students should be taught to read and write. And that's just not the case. I had the good fortune to grow up in a family with an English professor father and a preschool teaching mother. And, we just didn't, we read a lot, we talked a lot, we traveled, and I had multiple advantages. In getting into graduate school, I had the good fortune to accidentally meet David Yoder, who people probably now, if they're younger, may not quite appreciate as fully as they should. David was one of the co-founders of the field of augmentative and alternative communication. I just happened to be a student at the time. He moved from Wisconsin to UNC Chapel Hill.
Wow.
Met him. He then sort of introduced me to the population. We started visiting a school in Raleigh. And so I'm going to flip the question slightly. And that is, so when we went to this classroom in Raleigh, I met a young boy named Jabari who used, still to this day, the most elaborate eye gaze system I have ever seen. It was, I want to say, 4x4 grid. It had bliss symbols. It had words. It had colors. It had phrases. It had just everything you could possibly think of except the alphabet. And one of the questions I asked Jabari when I first met him was, which is often what I ask kids, what's your favorite book? And he told me with his symbols, brown food, big house. And I didn't know what he was saying. And so I said, is there any way you can tell me anything else? And he couldn't. He couldn't give me first letter of any of the words. He couldn't spell any of the words. He was an incredibly bright, capable kid. He was well known in his community as a fabulous poker player. People would move the cards for him, but he, would direct with his eyes. And so just super smart, super capable, not able to read and spell. And that really brought home to me the kinds of conversations that David and I were having, where I didn't fully understand or appreciate the difficulties or the challenges that some of these kids are dealing with their bodies or their voices or their health or go on and on and on. And so that was just a really helpful interaction. Now we just finished a week at camp in Grand Rapids last week, where I got to see some kids that I've met in 2014 and 2015 and who came to camp every year until COVID when we shut down. And this was the first time we'd reopened since COVID.
Oh, wow.
See, some of these kids are now 21, 19, 18, who read and write 4 and 5 years better than when we met them, to meet three of those kids, two of whom are going to 4-year colleges, and they're not majoring in crib courses. Like one kid's majoring in engineering. That kid couldn't spell when he was 12 years old, and he can spell anything he wants now.
Wow.
He always could read well. He always could communicate really effectively with symbols. What he couldn't do was go past that communication board with spelling, and now he can, and it's opened up the world for him. So
Wow.
exciting to see some of these kids over time.
Yeah, that is. And I love that here that, he was 12. So when some of us think of our students and think, well, they're already 12, and it's like it's not too late. There's never the wrong time to begin literacy instruction if students aren't reading and writing.
The ideal time is when you meet somebody who's willing to teach you.
Love that. Can you tell us a little bit about your camp?
Sure. It's Camp Alec. It's named after Gina, one of the organizers' sons, and has an acronym that I've known too long and couldn't tell you what it stands for. I'm sure you can find it. But years ago, Karen and I used to do, for 15 years, we did a literacy camp in Minnesota that was mostly walking, talking kids with disabilities. We'd get a few augmentative communication users each summer. One summer, Tina, who is Gina's friend, a lot of these moms know each other from the augmentative communication camps. And Tina brought her son, who uses augmentative communication, and then talked with Karen and me about whether we might be interested in trying to do a literacy camp that focused in AAC. And so that was sort of the initial conversation that led then Tina and Gina do all the organizing and keep the kids happy and interact with the families all year long, maintain a Facebook site, just do all the kinds of things that Karen and I could do, but it would take us away from all the gazillion other things that we're better at. And it's not that these folks don't also have lives. They have rich and busy lives, but they're committed to the kids, to their success. So they organize, and Karen and I do the teaching. We bring in roughly 20 kids with disabilities, almost all of whom are augmentative communication users. There was one exception to that, and has been for a couple of years. A girl who came by accident initially and then loved it so much she keeps coming back. She has cerebral palsy and loves writing, and very excitedly this year announced that she also loves reading now. And then toward the end of the week, figured out she had been doing all of her reading, listening to audio versions while she read. And Karen proposed to her that maybe she turn off that tape. She might find that she could still read, and she did, and she could. And so that was a real breakthrough for her to realize, I actually can read. Now it matters how difficult that text is, but that kid now can read, upper elementary stuff with understanding silently. And that's a huge amount of growth since we met her a couple of years ago. Well, pre-COVID. Continues to grow. So roughly 20 kids who use AAC, varying abilities from emergent to these kids this year who are a couple of them heading to college, and everything in between, and roughly the same number of professionals. So we bring in speech pathologists, special educators, sometimes administrators or OTs, people who would like to learn more and practice trying out some of the methods that we talk about in the book and have talked about for a long time.
Wow.
You bring up a good point when you're talking about how Karen says, turn off the audio and see what you can. And then she's like, oh, I'm a reader, right? She kind of has this epiphany. We have talked to people with early intervention too, where we're like, when we have typical children and we're reading and they fill in a line that's reoccurring, right? But he was still hungry, or they're saying, and you say to that typical child, and you say, did you read that? Right. And you are identifying them as readers and writers even before they are, conventional readers and writers. And there's a belief system within our young children that they will be readers and writers. I loved it. I was teaching my daughter to read and she was really young and my son was 2. And he said, when I become a girl, can I read? And I was like, well, you actually are going to read either way. But yes, basically they're like, they think that they're going to be readers and writers. And I wonder how much of that plays into so many things. Like you're talking about this girl that's been in these camps and really likes to write and all this stuff. And then there's this maybe unbelief that really am going to be a reader. And I wonder how much we play into that just by the way that we interact with our young students and the way that we talk about literacy in young ages. Can you speak a little bit to the power of that belief system?
Yeah, I think it's reflected in the language that we use that kids hear over and over. So I can think back to a couple of cases. My youngest son went to kindergarten, able to read at a very basic level and, willing to write. And, he couldn't spell. He was a kindergartner, but he sort of thought of himself as a reader and writer. He came home early in the school year with a picture that had his writing on it. And I said, that's fabulous. Can you read that with me? And he told me he couldn't read it. It was kindergarten writing. And so in an well-intentioned attempt to help the kids know they were learning how to spell, his teacher labeled what he was doing as something other than writing. Mm-hmm. And so a kid who would have 3 weeks prior to that read that willingly to me by making it up the same way other young writers do,
right,
was unwilling to take that chance. And so it's that sort of, it's not, you don't realize it's risk taking until you start calling it emergent writing or developmental spelling, or you tell kids they're reading a level A when they should be reading a level G, or,
right.
You can't, we put these barriers up that we intend them well, but they're all sort of adult language about what kids aren't doing that we view as necessary to be fully literate. And all of that language kids absorb and turn it into belief systems, right? And understandably. Your son's misinterpretation that reading is what girls do because that's what his sister was doing, right? Like, so do that sex change so we can read. Like, it's just, it's natural, it's funny, but it's real. Like it's a real belief system that we have to be really thoughtful about how we talk with kids. It's why you don't pretend to read what they're writing, because you're not sure, right? You ask them to you or with you. You ask them if they can't talk, like many kids who use AAC. What we don't want to do is ask them to tell us word for word with their device what it says, because that's not a read aloud experience. That's a matching experience. Instead, we'll say something like, well, can you tell me about your writing? And kids who have the ability will communicate one or two or elaborate composition in their symbols to talk about what they've written. When they can't do that, when they're still trying to figure out how AAC works, then what we need to do is find ways to interact that don't say something like, I heard an Iowa principal say, "Oh, you wrote a lot of letters." And I thought, that's not the message. That's not what you did. You were communicating. I can't read it yet. You're not conventionally literate enough or communicative enough symbolically to tell me about it. But we're devaluing it or giving you a false message when we say something like, "You wrote a lot of letters." It's not the goal. The goal is to communicate your thoughts to somebody else, or maybe just remember them for yourself later. And so we've taken to grabbing a picture or an object or an experience. And so when kids write something that we can't read, when they don't have the capability of communicating with us symbolically to talk about what they've written, we can at least acknowledge what a wonderful topic they're writing about and encourage them to write some more. So it's always, love what you wrote about swimming in the lake. Tell me more, right? And so it's, I value it. I want to hear you. I'm not going to pretend to be able to read it.
Right. I love that. Good point. And it's all about reframing how we are approaching it and what we are saying. And I'm just picturing some of those things you were saying, like some of the catchphrases, right? Like, tell me more. They seem so natural when we talk about it, but like you're saying with the principal, it's not always. And just having those up as reminders for people, like, I love that.
I was just thinking when you were talking about signs, one of the things Project Core I think has done is, I believe there's some place in that website where you can download posters and put up
Yeah.
reminders for practitioners.
Yeah,
I think
that's right.
great idea if you're new to this, just to remind yourself. It's different for everybody. Most special ed for kids with severe disabilities has not been very special. And when you start taking the view that kids can learn and will learn if you teach them effectively, you sort of need a transition to go from being nice to them to actually teaching. So
right. Even his comment, you wrote a lot of letters, doesn't actually even engage a person. Like there's no even required response there. And there's almost like I don't know if you can respond to me. So I'm not even going to try to say this differently. I think one of the things you always say is tell me more. And I think that's probably kind of maybe a guiding principle that runs through this literacy instruction, and both with reading and with writing, but tell me more seems to get, if someone is mean length of utterance of one word, then tell me more gets you to two, right? Tell me more works kind of across the board with communication and literacy. But so I was just wondering, we are asking all our guests kind of like, what are some of the guiding principles that you've learned along the way? And I know that there's a lot of them, but we are so interested to hear kind of what are these base principles that we all need to be paying attention to.
Well, the one answer is, we've talked about that in chapter 2. We called it conditions for learning. And so any and all of those I think are relevant when it comes to basic principles. The one that seems to be eye-opening more than some of the other, well, a couple, but one that sort of jumps out sometimes when we're talking about it with people is cognitive clarity, like helping kids understand why they're doing what they're doing. So much of what we do in school is schedule-based, IEP based, and we do it because we've always done it that way. We sort of get in this, it's educational inertia. We do it that way because we've always done it that way. Why are we doing English at 9 o'clock? Well, we always do English at 9 o'clock.
Right.
Why are we reading? Why are we putting our books away and going outside? Well, it's time for recess. There's no like that. All of that, kids can learn to follow schedules, but what you're getting at that point is behavioral compliance or non-compliance. Right. I don't want to do that, and so I resist. Or I'm a good kid. I'll do what you tell me. I don't really want to, and I got no idea why, but I'll do it because I'm a nice kid, and my mom will punish me if I don't. Like there's various reasons kids will do it, but it doesn't mean they understand. And cognitive clarity is really about understanding why you're doing what you're doing. And a story I've frequently told is visiting a student teacher years ago, and I walked in a kindergarten class where a boy was missing, and so I sat in his seat. And if you've ever visited a typically developing kindergarten class, the chairs are the sort of Lilliputian, they're tiny. And so it was a long time going from standing down to that chair. But as I was sitting in it and going down, I looked at the writing of the kid. They were all writing in journals, and I thought, this is fabulous. But what I realized that was less than fabulous was they weren't writing in their journals. They were using a notebook and making capital letter R's, one right after another, left to right. When they filled a line, they went to the next line. If you're familiar with child development, little girls tend at that age to have better fine motor control. So some of those little girls had filled the whole page with R's, and we're on to page 2 of capital R's. And so one of the questions I love asking kids in school is, what are you doing? And so this kid looked at me like I'm an idiot, like, aren't you an adult? Can't you see? And he says, making R's. And I said, next question, which is always really important, why? And so his answer, answers are predictable. His was not what I most frequently get, but also one I often get. But you often get, because she told me to, pointing to the teacher, right? Well, that's behavioral compliance. That's not cognitive clarity. I still don't know why I'm an R. And why am I making an R and not the number 3? Or reading a social studies book or going out to reset? Like, why am I making an R? What's the value for me personally now and in the future? And you can get that inductively, but it's better, especially when kids are young, to help them know up front. But what he told me, and so he didn't tell me that she told me to. What he did tell me was it was our day, which is a reasonable. Actually, I'm glad it was our day and not our week, or R until we have memorized R with 80% accuracy on 4 out of 5 days. Like, at least it was a daily change. But that's scheduling. That's teacher scheduling, and that's not language that should ever have been used with a kid. Imagine a kid with autism being told it's our day, and that kid wants to write an R word tomorrow, and it's not our day. What does that kid do? Right. So set up these challenges. But so it was our day, and the tweak on that, which you can't make up some of these stories. So the kid whose CD I was in, the kid who was absent was Robert. Like, why couldn't we be making R's so that we could write to Robert about what he missed in school, or that we missed him, or Robert, we're playing with trucks and the trucks go, and we could make, 16 R's, but we'd be making the noise that a truck makes, not making an R to make an R. We could make dinosaur roars. We could do all kinds of R things and help little kids understand it's not our day. And we're not making R's one after another for no reason other than she told me to. We're doing it because we can use it to communicate, in this case, to our buddy Robert, who's not here, about things that we like and he likes, and we can share ideas. In the meanwhile, practicing an R in isolation. So,
and isn't that more fun?
And much more
I'm thinking about, what does inclusion look like on the AAC device? Are they just hitting R as many times as they can, or are they using an alternative pencil to switch, to go all the partner assist scanning all the way to R? How many times have they got to do that? You know what I mean? Like, that's like taking a task and saying, how do I make that's inclusive in the sense that they're doing what everyone else is doing, but it's brutal, and futile.
Back to your original question. So you asked about principles. That was one. Cognitive clarity, and teachers have to have it before kids can have it. So I think if we don't know why we're teaching, we can't really explain it to kids in meaningful ways. And I don't think most teachers know why they're making R's other than it's our day. Thought deeply about communication, and particularly with kids who use AAC, the power of what we're teaching them when it comes to literacy. And I think that's really important to help them see, experience, feel, and never feel like they're not doing it right, or conventionally, or whatever level we think they need to be doing it at. Tell Me More has been really powerful. And we came across that just observing a 3rd grade classroom with a kid with autism who was doing some writing, and like many beginning writers, communicated in single words. And I mean, we watched this at camp this week. Ask a kid to write who's a beginning writer. If you get writing, it's going to be sort of single word or a couple of characters. And Tell Me More becomes powerful for expanding that. His aide didn't say tell me more specifically, but he would put one word and she'd say, he for instance, he's looking at this one page, he says wind. And she says, just wind? Wind. Just wind? Wind. Well, nothing else. And he says, blow. And so he's thinking and composing single words, but by saying in her way, tell me more. Loved and watching it. It's the first time we'd ever seen that, first of all. Most of what we do with writing feedback is really specific. Tell me more about the character. Write more about the setting. You misspelled this word. You left out this particular kind of information. Put these things in that if I were writing your paper, I would have put in, and you should too. And think that that's sort of helping a kid develop voice, develop his own way of communicating. The power of what she did was, I don't know if it's in your head, but I want to hear more of it. And so he ends up with this, the first day, instead of 6 words, 17 words across 6 pages. Wow. And so, like tripled his output just with that sort of, in various ways, saying, tell me more. almost none of them directive. And so we talked
Right.
about that, how excited we were. We talked with her at the end of the day. And she asked, what do I do tomorrow? And we said the same thing. She took that first draft. Again, think about how rarely this happens when we're teaching writing with any kids, let alone kids who use AAC. How often do they ever get to go back to a text and rework it in the way that real
Right.
writing, right? Typically, you write something, you turn it in, you get a grade, you get told all the things you did wrong, and a number gets put at the top or a letter. But that's not like there's not much learning opportunity there in the way that there is when you play with your thoughts repeatedly. He went back second day and all she did on each page was tell me more. And so he ends up with this extended text. I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 plus words. And so now it's gone from 6 words to 17 in first draft, tell me more, 17 to more than double in revision. And so it's that opportunity to explore your own thoughts with support. Like he wasn't going to put it himself. But if he's continually told, I want to hear what you have to say, and I don't quite understand what you're telling me, but not told, here's exactly what you need to tell me and how, he's developing his own way of communicating. And you get that skill that transfers into AAC, where perpetually you've got this telegraphic communication, because good communicators recognize if I don't communicate quickly, I'll lose my audience unless they're familiar with the way I communicate. So they give you 2 words, but you're not quite sure. So you say, can you tell me a little bit more? I'm not sure what you mean. Right? Well, that's honoring that communicator in ways that we rarely honor kid communicators.
Right. True. And I love that, you talk about that the goal of this is communicating your ideas in writing and so the teacher or the person that's helping them at camp is, they know the goal. They're not saying we got to add punctuation or whatever. It reminded me of your keynote speech that we loved from the Leading with Literacy from Building Wings. And you kind of talked about that. What is your goal? And that we want to continue to build them as readers and writers with that tell me more and adding. And I love the idea of, you talked about going back to the text multiple times, because not only does that let them continue to build their story and what they want to talk about, but I think it also kind of helps the adult to say it's okay to take this time because we're going to keep revisiting it, and it's okay because this is our goal, is to focus on this text, and we have multiple opportunities. I think sometimes we feel a lot of pressure to have a result or a specific thing we're looking for.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, I think the vocabulary is important. We're not calling it a correction. We're not correcting yesterday's work. Right. We're not, which is what when I think of my young children work, they bring home, they bring it home for corrections. Right. And it's like, that the teacher's like, well, that's where they're learning, when they're correcting their work. And I was like, okay, so how do we use different vocabulary around that? So, because if not, everything you wrote is wrong.
Right. If you think about, so I taught people who want to be teachers when they grew up for a long time. And I would ask questions like, do you like to read and do you like to write? And the people who don't like to read are fewer than the people who don't like to write. That is, do you choose to read when you don't have to? Do you choose to write when you don't have to? There are more people who choose to read as a form of relaxation, pleasure, seeking information that they don't have to seek. But when you ask them about experiences, what they all remember and are terrified by is oral reading, typically round robin, where their errors were pointed out to them and they were afraid of making mistakes. Yeah. And so, you got into that. If you was round robin, all the strategic kids were practicing their paragraph. They were counting, I'm going to be number 3. And they didn't learn anything. They just got practice at that one paragraph so that they made fewer errors and were embarrassed less. Right. But nobody enjoyed that. Nobody really learned to read by doing that. The other piece in writing is, if you ask, do you write when you don't have to? Almost no one raises their hand. I would contend it's because of that kind of instruction. All of the instruction we get in writing is error identification, and teachers, how on earth anybody, I don't think you can actually engage in learning and have the belief that teacher shared with you. So The best way to learn is to have all your errors pointed out to you. And isn't that a positive, rewarding experience? And don't you want to do that again tomorrow? Because it's really fun when people point out what you're not good at.
Right.
Right.
I would contend you can teach writing and kids never know they made a mistake. That'll never happen in public schools, but you could do it. And what you do is, as a teacher, you identify problems and you turn them into teaching tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. But you don't have to tell a kid he doesn't know how to spell some word. Add it to the word wall. Add it to the making word list. Help that kid in final draft, but you don't have to circle it, tell them it's wrong, make them figure it out. You don't have to you just don't have to. You do have to teach, and you can teach without identifying error. I'll just tell you, people are amazed at the writing the kids do at camp. Writing taught well is the easiest thing in the curriculum. It's inherently individualized. They can only do it at their own level with their own writing tool. You can make it more or less accessible, but if you don't tell them what they're doing wrong, you value it, you publish it, you share it with other people. Kids love writing. They love to communicate. And if you've got that, now you can teach. You can't teach writing in the absence of a text. So if kids won't write much because of your critique, you've lost the battle already.
Right.
I also think, though, and you talked about this in the keynote and lots of other times throughout the book, is it's individualized if they get to choose the topic that they want to read about. And definitely when I was in school, I can't remember ever having a choice. I'm sure somebody at some point did, but I can't remember ever having a choice of what to write about. It was, if it was like, write about your favorite food. And they think that's individualized because you get to pick something within this narrow category, right? Not to mention that so many AAC users are, G-tube fed and don't eat. And like the amount of discussion around food and reading around food and writing around food at this early is interesting. And it's apparent when you're working with kids that haven't experienced that, but that's sidebar. But the idea of how I think educators want to have it so structured that they pre-pick the topics, but how much of a disservice that really is in writing.
It takes away that. So part of the model that we've always worked off is probably the most frequently cited in writing research, and that's that Flower and Hayes from the early 80s. And what they did was ask literate young adults just to think aloud while they wrote. And they took that conversation and turned it into a model of what probably is going on in your head as you engage in composition. And one of those is the ability to generate topics. It's also the ability to organize them. It's also the ability to think about your topic relative to your audience and so on. If you pick topics, you're not giving kids opportunity to develop that skill. It's going to be critical as adults. So what happens when something wonderful happens in school, but that was never a topic that somebody gave you permission to write about or asked you to write about, and you don't know that you pick your own topics? Like, and people say, well, of course they know that. Well, how would you know it if you never had the experience? But the number of things that kids with disabilities do as teenagers and adults that they learn by being taught in one way. So think of the number of, I don't know how often you interact with speaking kids with Down syndrome. I can't name on one hand the number of those kids across my lifetime who read silently, because when they go home, mom says, you read this page and then I'll read this page. And so all of that's out loud. They go to school and a teacher says, read this out loud. And then the next kid reads out loud and the next kid read. They never read. They've never experienced it. No one's ever shown them. Nobody helps them make that transition. They don't read on their own. And so where on earth do they learn that if nobody shows them? It's the same with everything else. These kids have, because of their bodies and their health and everything else, a narrower range of experience than an advantaged child. And so the kinds of things they might learn by accident, they're less likely to learn by accident. The kinds of opportunities that kids have because they go grab something and mom reconfigures it into something safer or more conventional, that's just less possible. It's not impossible, but it just doesn't happen with that frequency. So you really have to be
Mm.
thoughtful about the learning environments you're creating and the things you're saying.
Right. Right. Dave, what do you feel most passionate about related to AAC and literacy? Is that a hard question?
Um, my belief that all kids can learn. I think that um, I've had the good fortune to work with really smart, capable people my entire career, starting with Yoder and Jim Cunningham, who was a reading comprehension whiz, Karen Erickson, Patsy Pierce, Jane Steelman, all people who were really good at something, emergent literacy, assistive technology, who knew things I didn't know, but believed kids could learn. Didn't, it wasn't that sort of battle lots of folks in schools are having to fight. If they start trying to teach in some of the ways we're proposing, sometimes that feels pretty foreign to places where they go, well, that's not realistic. And, we need to transition these kids to real, whatever that means. And what are the opportunities for kids, particularly kids who use AAC? What can they do as adults in the absence of the ability to spell and use syntax? They can say what somebody else allowed them to say. And, that just is, I can't imagine living that life myself, and I wouldn't want to put it on anyone else.
Right.
So, but I think we're too eager to do that. I think we look at bodies and assume brains are equally limited. We look at brains that we measure as limited and think there's not enough there to learn to read and write. I haven't found that brain yet.
Right.
Kids can learn to read and write. They can learn to spell. They can improve, even if they got to the level of a 4-year-old in terms of letter sound understanding. They'd be able to communicate way beyond their communication board just spelling phonetically. And wouldn't that open up the world for some of these kids?
Right.
So, I think it's not, and I remember people repeatedly, frequently from an LD orientation, asking sort of like, how do we predict that conventional learning success? And if we don't predict it, can we predict the ceiling? And no, I can't predict. I don't know who's going to learn or how far, but I believe they can if we figure it out. And it's on us. It's not on the learner. You don't have to feel guilty about that. Like, don't go home and lose sleep. We're going to lose sleep because we care. But the goal is not to lose sleep. The goal is to believe in kids, and when things aren't going well, problem solve and figure out with other capable, like-minded people who often don't know what you know and know things you don't. Get at that problem solving and try something else. Schools have sort of the opposite take and are getting more and more inflexible. Look at the science of reading. It's, as if there's only one way to teach phonics. That's baloney. As if this wasn't an argument that's been around since 1955. If you go back and recommend this to anybody listening, go back and read Why Johnny Can't Read, first published 1955. And if the arguments in that book don't sound exactly like the science of reading, you're not paying attention. But let's not pretend the science of reading is science, it's politics. And then let's think about what it requires of learners. And can we just stop thinking about it relative to the vast majority of kids with disability? It's bad enough we're doing it to non-disabled kids, but can we stop thinking about it relative to kids who don't have fine motor, who can't talk, who can't engage in metalinguistic rule memorization? Can we just look at the demands of what we're asking and think about alternatives for kids that just can't do those things, but are capable of learning if we would just stop being inflexible?
Right. And I think sometimes it starts with a connection too, that we have that personal connection and we are interested in what they know, what they want to tell us. And my mom was a elementary principal for many years, and she started in deaf education. And I recently found her journal from graduating college to start. And she said, I know these students I worked with in the clinic can become writers, and I think the first step is that I need to learn how to connect with them and how to help them see what they're writing. And I just thought it's about that connection. And I see that in your book all throughout. And I'm really enjoying what you're talking about with how we are reframing how we talk to students and what our goals are and how we connect with students. And that we know they can do it. I love that.
I think that's we've had more than a few teachers that are contemplating other careers that kind of get into this more problem-solving orientation and valuing learners and trying to help them progress in ways they're capable of. And I think it's just re-energizing. I think it's probably why most of us got into teaching, maybe not the problem solving, but we got into it because we cared about kids, cared about people, and all. So many things that have happened over the last few decades are anti-child, anti-teacher. Pulling books out of classrooms is not pro-child.
Right.
Telling people you can only teach one way is not pro-teacher. Threatening, tying teacher pay to student outcomes is absurd when you don't pick your students and you don't pick your neighborhood and you don't pick your school. Like, institute the draft and do it system wide, and then hold me accountable. And worst teacher gets first pick next year. Like, but we don't have a system where that is even vaguely fair or supportive of better teaching. And so, just, I don't know. There's so many people outside of education who think they can fix what really wasn't broken before they broke it. There's just a lot of things that we could do a whole lot better if we honored kids and we honored teachers and then tried to figure out how to support that enterprise instead of threaten it.
Right. Well, I think we are lucky that, like you said, these things are not new ideas. These principles have been around, but I think we're lucky that we have things like your book to re-energize us, like you said, to say, okay, I want to get together with the people who, my colleagues who I feel confident can do this with me and take a fresh look. And the resources are out there, luckily. And like you said, it's about problem solving and finding those people who you can ask when you don't know. And yeah.
I think one thing, definitely the book, you pulled together so many years of research. You would see this and go, oh, that's good. And then you'd read something later in your career, right? But I feel like you pulled together so much research and built on so many things. And that's something that, the average SLP and SPED teacher is not doing, right? Is pulling all that together. So the compilation of what we know about reading and writing that got put together in the book is just priceless. One of the things I don't know how I quote the book and know which one, if it was you or Karen that said it. But anyways, one of the things was, nobody is too anything to read or write, meaning nobody is too disabled. Nobody is too low. Nobody is too, has too short of an attention span. Nobody is too whatever. So I think one thing that we want to know is like, what do you do when, you were trying to elicit buy-in? What does an SLP who's like all in on all of this, or what does even a teacher, but the paras are not buying in or whatever? Do you have some advice about, getting buy-in for those reluctant, skeptical people that continue to believe that kids are too something to even provide the instruction?
I think Karen probably has more systematic answers to that than I do. The quote, by the way, comes from David Yoder.
Oh,
and actually from David Yoder's son, who asked if he could go out to play. And when his mom questioned his desire to go out, he said, well, it's not too anything. It's not too rainy. It's not too sunny. It's not too cold. It's not too hot. It's not too anything. Can I go out and play? David turned that into the statement that you were sharing, and used it repeatedly. It's ingrained in our life. In terms of helping, I think the center has a variety of projects now that are working school-wide or system-wide or multiple sites. My experiences have been more singular classroom and teaching, and less of that sort of system change that they're engaged in at this point. But some of the things I think, there's a certain amount of ignorance, and so I do think helping people know about some of the resources. And there's some really fine. Years ago, I was engaged in first thing I did in graduate school to pay the bills was look at adolescent literacy programs with another nonprofit center. And we traveled all around the country and looked at various ways that people were helping struggling readers at the adolescent in middle school make progress. And one of the things was we found individuals could make a big difference if they were in the right position. So a reading coordinator could make a change over multiple staff, or a special ed coordinator, or. And what we saw repeatedly was they had some sort of ongoing training going on. So whether it was we're doing a book study this semester, and next semester we're going to implement shared reading or whatever, that sort of ongoing, not we'll talk about it this week and then we don't talk about it anymore, unless you come to me with a problem or whatever. But if you're a teacher, if you're a speech pathologist, you know how isolating those professions can be. You're typically one-to-one or one to a group with no other adult being in charge except you. And if you're teaching kids with severe disabilities, there might be 2 additional adults who are supporting but don't have necessarily more than a high school education and may or may not have experience with disabilities, and who may or may not have ever been in a classroom where people thought those kids could learn. And so it's a different proposition, but you kind of feel alone. So I think those ongoing conversations are really powerful. One of the things Dick Allington learned and shared from his work trying to shift views of teachers and methods was that one of the best things you can do in one of those power positions of a little bit more than a classroom power. So you're the coordinator of something, or the lead teacher, or the grade level chair, or the whatever. One of the things he found was work with the people who want to change first. So people who want to figure out how to teach these kids, who believe they can but don't know how, are the people to put some energy into, because that's where you will get some bang for your buck. Every kid deserves a good education. We're not there yet. And so sometimes then creating these models of, look how well it works in this teacher's classroom, incentive for additional teachers. The National Writing Project did a really interesting study years ago. I don't remember the title, but I've always called it the adjacent classroom study. What they did was look at what happened in the classroom of teachers who went through the writing project in the summer program. When they went back to school, did they implement what they've been taught? And they did. There were big changes from previous year to first year after being taught. But what they also did that was clever was look at adjacent classrooms. So the classroom to the left and to the right of that teacher, did they find any changes? And in fact, they did. And so what happened was, apparently either teachers talked in the hallway, or kids moved between classrooms and teachers heard excitement and they wanted to know, what's going on. But in some way, there's sort of that bleed of interesting different ideas that seem to be working on some level. I think most teachers want to be good. I think they want to help kids. I think they're sometimes tired of being told what to do. They're being tired of being told to do something that won't work. And they're sometimes frustrated they don't know what the alternatives might be, even if they have that freedom. And so information is really powerful. I think that's what the center has been able to do. It's a nonprofit. There's nothing for sale at the center.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yes. The resources are just generous and amazing. And you need an alternative pencil, you can find it. Yeah. So
you make a good point, though, is focusing on people who are ready for change, because if you focus on the last person who's willing, you will burn out before you change a mindset. Right. And that's what we're seeing too, is some people are, getting disheartened or leaving the field or going private, or which is all fine if that's where you're supposed to go. But it's like, how do we retain really good teachers and build them up? And I think you're right. I think you have to kind of keep an eye out for the people who are believers in these kids. They just don't have the tools, because now we have a few tools, That's a good idea.
And in just a few locations, you mentioned earlier, in the 80s, people would say, so where do I learn more about this? And you'd say, well, there's this woman, Patty King DeBon, who's a teacher down in Atlanta. And I think she's got a book out. And there's this other teacher in Asheville, Caroline Musselwhite, and I think she's got a book, or maybe she does workshops or something.
Yeah.
And I read this paper, and I'll get you a copy. But it was like everything was everywhere, and there wasn't much. Right?
There wasn't a lot in the encyclopedia at that point either.
Right. Now we've got a book that'll get you introduced. We teach courses regularly. We have multiple doctoral students who've gone through either Karen's school or mine. There's a growing number of people who understand central principles and are doing it reasonably well. And I think having a little humility in that, and I think sometimes there's a little bit of territoriality in our field. I'm not quite sure why it's so tiny.
Yeah.
And I think if we just look and go from a child place first, and a teacher, clinician, practitioner place, and a parent place, I think that we can do lots of good, and we don't have to feel threatened by one another so much as figure out what works.
Yes, and then share that with others. So I'm thinking about listeners who are very excited now. They knew they were interested in supporting literacy. They've heard from you. They're going to get your book. What would you tell them as a suggested starting point for literacy instruction?
I'd say read the book and then decide the answers to those 4 questions. So we have 4 questions we describe in the book. Answer yes, no for your kids. So they include things like, is the child engaged during shared reading? Not do they understand the book when you're reading it? Are they engaged? Mm-hmm. So they look at the page, they look at you, do they sit with you? Or are they that kid that's all over the room, or that kid whose head never comes up, or, right? And so if you answer those 4 questions, then I need to be doing comprehensive emergent, or I need to do comprehensive conventional. Having made that decision, do it all. Don't start with one piece. We've found it's better to do all of them badly and get better than to do one of them to perfection.
Right. What you're saying is don't just do shared reading because you're confident with shared reading. Do writing. Do all of the things every day. Mm-hmm.
If I had followed that advice, I would have taught phonics in 7th grade when I was a teacher. I didn't teach phonics because it didn't occur to me that even though I had a student who couldn't spell his own name, that probably I should be teaching phonics in a meaningful way to some of the students in my 7th grade class. I was comfortable teaching reading. I knew how to teach reading comprehension. I had worked with Jim Cunningham. He was a whiz. Believe in his methods, his approaches. I had been a writing project fellow, so I loved teaching writing, enjoyed it. I could get kids motivated. We were doing lots of writing. We were revising in a day when we didn't have computers, so we'd rewrite by hand, and they'd still do it because they were going to publish. I was comfortable with self-directed reading. I read out loud to my kids. They loved it. We had silent reading time. I had a huge in-class library because I grew up in a reading house. Mm-hmm. What I didn't teach was phonics. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I didn't think that most approaches were age appropriate, and I just didn't have enough experience. Mm. And so I never got to it. In 4 years of teaching, I never got to it. Right. And that's my fear, if you don't jump in on all, that you replicate the failures of the past. And so jump in on all the pieces. And then if at all possible, find a colleague who's either doing it already or willing to jump in with you. So you can compare notes, because I think those conversations are really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And problem solving orientation, it's really helpful to have like-minded folks who either have different experiences or different expertise than you do. I think that's where the progress comes. Then go to the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies online and look through the infinite variety of free resources.
Yes.
Well, I
Yeah.
love two things about that. One, that you weren't good at all of this when you were born. that gives us all hope. And I mean, also that yeah, we all gravitate towards the areas that we feel comfortable in teaching. And we just like our readers and writers, we don't want to do something we're not good at. And so we have to even model that, we're on the struggle bus with, I think a lot of SLPs are on the struggle bus with writing. I think we get phonics. I think we get letters. I think we get a lot of the reading components. And then we look at writing and we're like, is that the OT's job? Or what if it's not? Like, what is writing versus the AAC? Like, there's a lot of like, it's a little bit daunting. But I think if you go, well, I'll just let someone else do that part, then it's not comprehensive, is it? So it's like you can't wait. You only get better at it by trying and failing. And so you might as well get started, get failing so that you can figure it out.
Never going to be easier than today. It's only going to get more complex and complicated over time. So
yeah.
I like the struggle bus. Hadn't heard that before.
Oh, well, it's been so fun to hear from you. I'm sure we can talk to you all day, actually. But what do you want people to know about what you're doing now? Besides retiring, obviously you're retiring, but what projects are you working on now? Where are you speaking at next? What's kind of going on with you professionally?
I don't know where I'm speaking next. I'm not sure if I have anything lined up.
Okay.
COVID brought a lot of that to a
Right.
screeching halt.
Mm-hmm.
I do think our camp is reopened and will stay open.
Right.
I plan and hope to stay involved with that. That's a really useful, energizing week. I hope that we can expand on that. I won't be directly responsible for that. The things that I think I want to put my energy into are what you were just talking about, and that is writing instruction. And so I think what I would like to do is a writing methods text, think about some of the problems that people are experiencing, talk about some of these issues of teaching rather than identifying error, helping kids, generate their own topics, not tell them what to write, try and put that in the context of what people are really trying to deal with in schools these days. So there's a bridge for people to move in a different direction.
That would be so useful. We would love to see that.
There's a need for more mini lesson ideas. So we've talked about trying to teach writing in particular, but most of literacy in mini lessons. So talk less and let kids experience more, and help them process that. But don't talk a lot. Kids don't get better at reading or writing if we talk at them a lot, and don't let them read and write a lot. I think having a more comprehensive list of mini lessons would also be a useful thing. So I'm playing with those ideas, and I don't know for sure. I have a number of unfinished papers. They'll get done eventually. So.
I bet you release the book and then you see, oh, look at how they interpreted that, despite what explicitly we said. I guess they, aka me and everybody else, need a little more instruction on that. Like, despite the fact that the sentence is there, don't do this, this is still how it was interpreted. And now we're seeing how how we all took that information and took it from our angles. I know this because, like, even just doing any training on AAC, and then I leave and come back and then I'm like, oh, so that's how you took that. That's what you did. You know what I mean? Or, wow, we really overdid that one comment I made. I didn't realize you were going to glom onto that and do that daily, because that's actually not comprehensive. So I'm sure the book has been amazing for all of us, but I bet as the writer, you've been like, wow, okay, all right. Some of this has been taken in out of context. Some of this has been overgeneralized. Some of this has been forgotten. It's right there. It's on the next page. We said this, and yet no one did that. So I love that you're thinking about mini and writing lessons in particular, because I think that's where a lot of us don't feel as strong. And I bet that's where you feel like, oh, let's get clear on this, because the application of our ideas are not looking like we'd hoped in some ways or another.
Yeah, no, I think that's all accurate. Probably we need to revise that book as well. So
edition 2.
Getting toward that stage. So.
Well, we can't wait to hear more from you and see what comes next. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm so excited about this whole conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this podcast. I think it's a great service. So.
Thank you.
Oh, great.